The October wind whipped across Montana's barren plains as Miriam Hayes stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, her two children clutching her worn skirts. Every woman in the county had tried to win Eli Grant's heart, only to be turned away by his cold indifference. But Miriam didn't come with sweet words or batting eyelashes. She walked straight to the notorious bachelor rancher and delivered the question that would change everything. You want a wife, or just another winter alone? Friends, settle in for a story that proves sometimes love arrives not with flowers, but with raw honesty. Drop a comment about where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these frontier tales travel. The stagecoach wheels groaned to a halt outside Morrison's general store, kicking up a cloud of dust that seemed to hang in the October air like a warning. Eli Grant had been leaning against the corral fence for the better part of an hour, watching the horizon with the kind of patience that only comes from years of waiting for nothing in particular. At 34, he'd built himself a reputation as solid as the mountains that bordered his ranch, dependable, stubborn, and utterly immune to the charms of every marriageable woman in Silver Creek County. "Here she comes," muttered Tom Morrison from the store's porch, spitting tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Another widow heading west, third one this month." Eli didn't turn his head, but his jaw tightened imperceptibly. He'd seen enough broken families drifting through Montana territory, each one carrying dreams as fragile as spring ice. The war had left too many widows, too many fatherless children, and too many men like him who'd learned that caring for people only meant watching them leave, or worse, watching them die. The coach door swung open with a creak that echoed across the near-empty street. First came a boy, maybe 10 years old, with sandy hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen too many miles. He jumped down with the kind of energy that suggested he'd been cooped up far too long, then turned to help someone else. A girl followed, younger, perhaps 7, with dark braids and a cloth doll clutched against her chest, like it held all the security in the world. She moved carefully, deliberately, as if she'd learned that rushing led to stumbling, and stumbling led to attention she didn't want. Then came the woman. Miriam Hayes emerged from the coach with a grace that seemed at odds with her travel-worn appearance. Her brown dress had been mended at least twice that Eli could see, the patches carefully matched but still visible to anyone who looked close enough. Her bonnet had lost its shape somewhere between wherever she'd started and here, but she wore it with a dignity that suggested she'd chosen not to notice. She was perhaps 30, with lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and tears, though Eli suspected the tears had been winning lately. She stood for a moment, surveying the town. If you could call 24 buildings huddled against the vastness of Montana a town. Her gaze swept across Morrison's store, the barbershop with its striped pole faded by sun and wind, the saloon that was already starting to leak piano music and rough laughter despite the early hour. Finally, her eyes found Eli. He expected her to look away, the way most women did when they caught him staring. His reputation preceded him. The rancher who'd sent Sally Morrison home in tears when she'd brought him a pie and a proposition. The man who'd told the widow Thornton that he had no use for a wife who couldn't tell a heifer from a bull. The bachelor who'd built his ranch alone and intended to die the same way. But Miriam Hayes didn't look away. Instead, she studied him with an intensity that made him straighten despite himself. Then, in a move that would be talked about in Silver Creek for months to come, she took her children by the hands and walked directly toward him. "Mama," the girl whispered, tugging on her mother's skirt. "Who's that man?" "Hush, Clara," Miriam said softly, but her eyes never left Eli's face. The boy, Eli would later learn his name was Thomas, pulled against his mother's grip. "We're supposed to go to the boarding house." Mrs. Morrison said, "We'll get there, Thomas. First, I need to speak to someone." Eli found himself pushing away from the fence, his body responding to some challenge he couldn't quite name. Up close, he could see the fatigue that Powder couldn't hide, the determined set of her jaw that suggested she'd made hard decisions before and would make them again. She smelled faintly of lavender water and dust, an oddly appealing combination that made him think of gardens planted in difficult soil. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to be heard without raising her voice, far enough to maintain propriety. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. Tom Morrison had come down from his porch, and Eli could see faces appearing in windows like curious flowers turning toward an unexpected sun.
You're Eli Grant, she said. It wasn't a question. I am. I'm Miriam Hayes. These are my children, Thomas and Clara. She paused, seeming to gather something from deep within herself. I hear you're looking for a wife. A snort from Tom Morrison broke the silence.
Ma'am, that's the last thing Eli Grant is looking for. Man's turned down every woman in the county, and a few from the next county over.
Miriam didn't acknowledge the interruption. Her gaze remained fixed on Eli's face, reading something there that he wasn't sure he wanted read. Is that so? She asked. You've turned down every woman? Eli crossed his arms, a defensive gesture he immediately regretted. I'm not looking for a wife, Mrs. Hayes. I've got a ranch to run. And winter coming on, she observed. Hard to run a ranch when you're trying to keep house, too. Hard to mend fences when you're mending clothes. Hard to break horses when you're breaking ice on the water troughs every morning. I manage. I'm sure you do. She shifted Clara to her other side, the movement practical rather than nervous. But managing isn't living, Mr. Grant, and from what I hear, you've been managing for a long time. The crowd had grown. Eli could feel their eyes, their judgment, their entertainment at his expense. Any other woman would have been withering under the attention, but Miriam Hayes stood as steady as a fence post, waiting for his response. Mrs. Hayes, he said, his voice carrying the kind of finality that usually ended conversations, I appreciate your directness, but I'm not in the market for a wife. I suggest you try your luck with one of the other bachelors in town. Pete Sawyer's been looking to settle down, or so I hear. Pete Sawyer drinks, she said flatly, and Jim Thompson has a temper. Carl Brennan already has his eye on the school teacher, though she doesn't know it yet. And Ben Wallace is sweet but weak. He'd fold at the first hard winter or dry summer. Eli blinked. She'd been in town less than 5 minutes and had already cataloged the available men like she was reading from a ledger. You've done your research, he said, unable to keep a note of respect from his voice. I have 2 children, Mr. Grant. I can't afford to make mistakes based on romantic notions or desperate choices. She pulled Clara closer, the gesture protective but not fearful. I know what you're thinking. Another widow looking for a meal ticket. Another woman who thinks she can change the unchangeable man. Another romantic fool who believes love conquers all. And you're not? No. The word was sharp, clean, like a blade through butter. I buried my husband 2 years ago. He died of fever, left me with 2 children and debts I'm still paying. I've worked as a seamstress, a laundress, a cook. I've taken in boarders and sold everything of value except my mother's wedding ring. She held up her left hand where a simple gold band caught the late afternoon light. I'm not here for love, Mr. Grant. I'm here for survival, mine and my children's. The honesty was brutal, refreshing, and somehow more appealing than any flirtation he'd ever received. But Eli had built his walls for reasons, good reasons, and he wasn't about to let them crumble for a pair of tired eyes and a direct manner. I wish you luck, Mrs. Hayes, but... She interrupted him, something no one in Silver Creek had dared to do in years. Let me ask you something, Mr. Grant, and I'd appreciate an honest answer, though I suspect honesty isn't your problem. She took a step closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Do you want a wife? Or do you just want another winter alone? The question hung in the air like a challenge, like an accusation, like a key to a door he'd locked so long ago he'd forgotten what lay behind it. Around them, the crowd seemed to lean in, waiting for his response. Alone's never bothered me, he said, but the words came out rougher than intended. No? She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that would have been coquettish on another woman, but on her seemed merely analytical. Then why do you come to town every week when your ranch doesn't require it? Why do you stand at this fence watching the stagecoach arrive? Why do you have Tom Morrison order you books you don't need and supplies you've already got? Tom Morrison coughed. Now, how did you... You talk, Mr. Morrison, to your wife, who talks to Mrs. Brennan at the boarding house, who talked to me when I wired ahead for a room. She turned back to Eli. You're not waiting for supplies, Mr. Grant. You're waiting for something else. The question is whether you know what it is. Eli felt exposed, like she'd peeled back his skin to examine what lay beneath. His first instinct was to walk away, to mount his horse, and ride back to his ranch where the only questions came from which fence needed mending first. But something, pride perhaps, or curiosity,
kept him rooted. "You don't know me, Mrs. Hayes." "No," she agreed, "but I know loneliness. I know what it looks like when it's been carved into a person's bones. I know the difference between choosing to be alone and being afraid of anything else." Thomas tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama, I'm hungry." "In a moment, Thomas." She kept her eyes on Eli. "I'm not asking you to marry me, Mr. Grant. I'm not asking you for anything except honesty. You need help on your ranch. I need a safe place for my children. We could help each other without all the complications that seem to terrify you so much." "And what makes you think complications terrify me?" She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face from handsome to something approaching beautiful. "Because you're still standing here talking to me instead of walking away. A man who wasn't afraid would have left by now, secure in his decision. A man who wasn't afraid wouldn't need to prove how unafraid he was." The logic was irritating in its accuracy. Eli found himself reassessing the woman before him. This wasn't some desperate widow throwing herself at the first available man. This was someone who'd learned to read people the way he read weather patterns, as a matter of survival. "What are you proposing, exactly?" he heard himself ask, and immediately wanted to take the words back. "A business arrangement," she said promptly. "I'll keep your house, cook your meals, mend your clothes. I'm a good cook, not fancy, but filling. I can stretch $1 until it screams for mercy. I know how to preserve food, maintain a garden, doctor minor injuries. Thomas is old enough to help with light chores, and Clara's learning to sew and help with household tasks. And in return, room and board for myself and my children. Protection. A chance to build something stable instead of constantly running from debts and desperation." She paused. "And time. Time to see if two practical people might find something more than a business arrangement, without the pressure of promises neither of us is ready to make." It was the most sensible proposition he'd ever received, which somehow made it the most dangerous. Sally Morrison had offered passion, the widow Thornton had offered experience, and half a dozen others had offered various combinations of beauty, wealth, or connections. Miriam Hayes was offering exactly what he needed and nothing he'd asked for. "My ranch is 7 miles from town," he said, testing her resolve. "The nearest neighbor is 3 miles away. It's isolated." "Good. I've had enough of close neighbors and their opinions." "The work is hard." "I'm not afraid of work. The winter's coming. It gets cold, bitter cold. The wind comes down from the mountains like it's got a personal grudge. Mr. Grant," she said with a hint of amusement, "I've survived 2 winters in a drafty boarding house with walls so thin I could hear every conversation, every argument, every moment of despair from 6 other families. I've kept my children warm with nothing but determination and newspaper stuffed in the walls. Your ranch house has a roof and walls that keep the wind out?" "It does." "Then we'll be fine." He was running out of objections, which alarmed him more than her proposition. "People will talk." "People are already talking. Look around you." He did. The entire population of Silver Creek's Main Street seemed to have found urgent business that required them to loiter within earshot. Mrs. Morrison had joined her husband, her hands twisted in her apron. The blacksmith had stopped hammering. Even the saloon had produced a few early patrons who leaned against the batwing doors with obvious interest. "Let them talk," Miriam continued. "Talk doesn't put food on the table or wood in the stove. Talk doesn't keep children safe or cattle fed. I stopped caring about talk the day I had to choose between my pride and my children's hunger." Claire had pressed herself against her mother's skirt, but Thomas stood straighter, trying to look older than his years. The boy met Eli's gaze with a directness that reminded him of his mother, and Eli saw something there. Not defiance exactly, but a determination to protect what was his. It was a look Eli recognized, one he'd worn himself at that age, when the world had taken his parents and left him to figure out survival on his own. "The boy," Eli said. "He knows how to work?" "He learns fast," Miriam answered. "His father was a clerk, so Thomas knows his letters and numbers better than most. But he's willing to learn whatever you're willing to teach." "I can work," Thomas interjected, his voice cracking slightly but gaining strength. "I'm not afraid of horses or cattle. I helped at the livery stable in Omaha for food. I can lift hay bales and carry water and—" "Thomas," Miriam said gently, but Eli held up a hand. "Let the boy speak."
Thomas swallowed, then continued. I know I'm not as strong as a full-grown man, sir, but I'm stronger than I look, and I don't give up. My mama needs this. Clara needs this. I won't let you down if you give us a chance. The earnestness in the boy's voice did something to Eli's chest, a tightening that felt uncomfortably like emotion. He'd been that boy once, negotiating for survival, trading promises for opportunities, learning too young that the world didn't offer second chances to those who failed to seize the first one. And the girl? He asked, his voice gruffer than intended. Clara peeked out from behind her mother's skirt. She was small for 7, with the kind of delicate features that would either serve her well or poorly, depending on how the world chose to treat her. But her eyes were sharp, taking in everything with an intelligence that suggested she understood more than her years should allow. Clara helps with whatever she can, Miriam said. She's learning to cook, to sew, to tend chickens if you have them. She's quiet. Won't be any trouble. I don't like noise, Clara said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll be quiet. I promise. The promise was so earnest, so carefully offered, that Eli found himself wondering what had taught a 7-year-old to offer silence as a virtue. He thought of his ranch house, empty except for the sound of wind and his own footsteps, and wondered if maybe silence wasn't the blessing he'd convinced himself it was. I'd need to think on it, he said finally. Of course. Miriam's expression didn't change, but he saw her shoulders drop slightly, the only sign of disappointment she allowed herself. We'll be at the boarding house for a few days while I look for work. If you decide, no. The word came out sharper than intended. I mean, I don't need days. I just need... He looked at the crowd, at the expectant faces, at the children who were trying so hard to be brave. Not here. Not with an audience. Understanding flickered in Miriam's eyes. Where? He thought for a moment. Can you ride? Yes. The children? Thomas can. Clara can ride with me. He nodded. There's a place about a mile out of town, a creek with some cottonwoods. You know it, Tom? Tom Morrison nodded. The old Jameson claim. That's the one. Can you get there? We'll need horses, Miriam said practically. Tom can lend you his wagon, Eli said, looking at the store owner with an expression that brooked no argument. Can't you, Tom? Well, I suppose. Good. 1 hour. He looked back at Miriam. We'll talk there, properly, without half the town listening in. She nodded, then did something unexpected. She held out her hand to shake, like a man would, like equals sealing a business arrangement. After a moment's hesitation, Eli took it. Her hand was calloused, strong, steady. Not the soft, pampered hand of someone looking for rescue, but the hand of someone who'd learned to rescue herself and was simply looking for better ground to stand on. 1 hour, she agreed. Eli released her hand and walked toward his horse, aware that every eye followed him. As he mounted, he heard Tom Morrison's stage whisper. I'll be damned. She got him to talk to her for more than 30 seconds. That's more than Sally managed in 3 years of trying. Tom Morrison, his wife scolded. Watch your language. There are children present. But Eli also heard something else. Miriam Hayes's quiet voice as she ushered her children toward the boarding house. Come along, Thomas, Clara. We need to wash up before our meeting. Is he going to help us, Mama? Clara asked. I don't know, sweetheart. But he's thinking about it, and that's more than we had this morning. As Eli rode toward the cottonwoods, he found himself replaying the conversation, examining it for tricks, manipulations, the kind of emotional snares that women had tried to use on him before. But there had been none of that, just brutal honesty, practical assessment, and a proposal that made sense in a way that frightened him more than any romantic overture ever had. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if he'd been the type to notice such things. The ranch waited for him, empty, efficient, productive. Everything he'd built it to be. Everything he'd told himself he wanted. Do you want a wife? Or do you just want another winter alone? The question echoed in his mind as he rode. He'd survived 10 winters alone on the ranch, each one blending into the next in a rhythm of chores and seasons. He'd convinced himself that loneliness was just another word for independence,
that isolation was the same as strength. But Miriam Hayes had seen through that fiction with uncomfortable clarity. He reached the cottonwoods before them, which gave him time to think. The creek babbled softly, swollen with late summer rain but beginning to slow as autumn took hold. This place had been his thinking spot for years, far enough from town to avoid casual visitors, close enough to reach when he needed supplies. The Jameson claim had failed 5 years back, bad water management, worse financial planning. But the trees remained, stubborn and enduring. Like him. Or at least like he'd thought he was before a direct woman with tired eyes asked him a question he couldn't answer. The sound of wagon wheels announced their arrival. Tom Morrison drove, looking uncomfortable with his role in this drama. Miriam sat beside him with Clara on her lap, while Thomas rode in the back with their meager luggage, 2 carpet bags and a small trunk that probably held everything they owned. "I can wait," Tom offered as the wagon stopped. "Take you back to town after." "No need," Miriam said, climbing down with Clara, then helping Thomas with the bags. "We'll make our own way back." "But—" "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." Her tone was polite but final. Tom looked at Eli, seemed to think better of whatever he was about to say, and drove off with obvious relief. They stood there for a moment, the 4 of them, while the creek filled the silence. Clara had found a stick and was drawing patterns in the dirt. Thomas stood protective near the luggage, as if ready to grab it and run if necessary. Miriam simply waited, patient as stone. "Your husband," Eli said finally. "How did he die?" "Cholera. It took him in half our street in Kansas City. We were lucky to survive." "Lucky?" He tested the word. "That's what you call it?" "We're alive, Mr. Grant. My children have food in their bellies and possibilities in their future. Yes, I call that lucky." "And you came here why? Montana's no place for a woman alone?" She smiled without humor. "Neither was Kansas City. Neither was anywhere else I tried. At least here, there's land, space, a chance to build something instead of just surviving day to day. Building requires money. Building requires work. Money helps, but work is what matters." She moved to sit on a fallen log, gesturing for the children to play by the creek, but stay close. "What do you want to know, Mr. Grant? Ask your questions. I'll answer honestly." He remained standing, needing the small advantage of height. "You researched me. Why?" "Because I research everything that might affect my children's future. I knew I was coming to Silver Creek. It was as far as my money would take me. I wrote to Mrs. Brennan at the boarding house, asked about work opportunities, about the town, about the people. She's a gossip, but an informative one." "And she told you about me?" "She told me about everyone. But yes, you featured prominently in her letters. The mysterious Eli Grant, who built his ranch from nothing, who needs no one, who turns away every woman who tries to capture his attention." She looked up at him. "She thought it was romantic. I thought it was interesting." "Why?" "Because a man who turns away every woman isn't afraid of women. He's afraid of something else. Loss, perhaps, or betrayal, or maybe just the vulnerability that comes with letting someone matter." Each word felt like a probe, searching for soft spots in his armor. "You're very sure of yourself, Mrs. Hayes." "No, I'm observant. There's a difference." She watched Clara show Thomas something she'd found by the water, a smooth stone or interesting stick. "I've had to learn to read people quickly, Mr. Grant. To know who's dangerous, who's safe, who's worth the risk. It's kept us alive and relatively unharmed." "And what did you read in me?" She considered the question. "Safety, oddly enough. A man truly cold wouldn't have stayed to listen. A man truly cruel wouldn't have suggested we meet away from the crowd. You're not unkind, Mr. Grant. You're just protected." "Maybe I have reasons." "Everyone has reasons. The question is whether those reasons are still worth what they cost." She stood, brushing off her skirt. "I'm not asking you to bare your soul or share your secrets. I'm asking for a chance to prove we could be useful to each other." "For how long?" "Through winter, at least. Come spring, if it's not working, we'll move on. No harm done, no promises broken. And if it is working, then we reassess. Make new arrangements based on new information." She met his gaze directly. "I'm not trying to trick you into marriage, Mr. Grant. I'm trying to survive winter with my dignity and my children's safety intact. Thomas had wandered closer, ostensibly skipping stones but clearly listening. The boy had good instincts, protective without being obvious about it. Eli wondered if that was natural or learned, then decided it didn't matter. Either way, it spoke well of him. The ranch house has 3 bedrooms, Eli said, surprising himself by engaging with the practicalities. You and the girl could take one, the boy another. That's generous? That's practical. Everyone needs privacy. He paused. There's a stove in the kitchen, a pump inside for water. The root cellar's well stocked, and there's a smokehouse with enough meat to last until I can hunt again. You're self-sufficient. I've had to be. Yet you're considering taking in 3 strangers. I'm considering a business arrangement that might benefit all parties involved. But even as he said it, he knew it was more than that. Something about this woman's directness, her lack of pretense, her willingness to name things for what they were. It appealed to him in ways that beauty or charm never had. "Mama," Clara called, "look what I found!" She held up a piece of quartz that caught the late afternoon sun, sparkling like captured stars. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Put it in your pocket to keep." "Can I show Mr. Grant?" Miriam glanced at Eli, silently asking permission. He nodded, and Clara ran over, her earlier shyness overcome by excitement. "See?" She held out the stone. "It's like ice, but warm." Eli knelt to look at it properly, the movement bringing him to Clara's eye level. "That's quartz. There's a lot of it in the creek bed. Indians used to say it held sunlight for dark days." "Really?" Her eyes widened. "Can I keep it?" "It's yours. You found it." She smiled, the first genuine, childlike expression he'd seen from her, and something in Eli's chest shifted uncomfortably. He stood quickly, stepping back. "The ranch is isolated," he said to Miriam, returning to practical matters. "The nearest school is in town. The children would need—" "I can teach them," Miriam interrupted. "I have books, and I've taught before, helping at the school in Kansas City when they needed extra hands. Supplies would need to be planned. I go to town once a week, weather permitting. I'm good at planning ahead. There's no doctor nearby. If someone gets sick, I've nursed 2 children through everything from croup to broken bones. I know my limits, but I also know basic medicine." He was running out of objections again, and she knew it. Her expression remained patient, but there was something in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, carefully controlled, but present. "Why me?" he asked finally. Tom Morrison was right. There are other men, easier men, who jump at this arrangement. She was quiet for a moment, watching her children play by the creek. "Because you won't hurt us," she said simply. "You won't drink away the grocery money or raise your hand in anger or make promises you don't intend to keep. You're honest about what you're offering and what you're not. That's rarer than you might think." "How can you be sure?" "I can't, but I've gotten good at calculating risks, and you're the best risk in Silver Creek." She turned to face him fully. "I'm not looking for love, Mr. Grant. I had that once, and losing it nearly killed me. I'm looking for stability, safety, a chance for my children to grow up without fear. You're looking for help without emotional entanglement. We could give each other what we need without demanding what neither of us is ready to offer." The proposition was so logical, so clean, that it should have been easy to accept or refuse. But nothing about this felt easy. Eli found himself thinking of winter mornings when the silence pressed against his ears like cotton, of evenings when he'd catch himself talking to the horses just to hear a voice, of the bed he'd built for 2 that had only ever held 1. "I'd need rules," he heard himself say. "Of course. Clear boundaries, separate spaces, no expectations beyond what we agree to. I wouldn't have it any other way. The children would need to understand this is temporary, might not last beyond spring." Miriam's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in her composure. "I'll handle that if it becomes necessary." "When?" he corrected. "When it becomes necessary." "If you say so." But there was something in her tone that suggested she saw more possibilities than he did, or perhaps was simply more willing to acknowledge them. Thomas had moved closer again, and this time he addressed Eli directly. "Sir, if you take us on, I promise we won't be trouble. I can learn whatever you need. I'm good with my hands, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "Work on a ranch isn't like work in town, boy." "I know, sir, but I can learn."
Eli studied him, the too-thin frame that would fill out with good food and hard work, the determined set of his jaw that echoed his mother's, the hands that were soft now but wouldn't stay that way. "Can you ride?" "Some. I could learn better." "Can you shoot?" Thomas glanced at his mother, then back at Eli. "No, sir. My father didn't believe in guns. Out here, guns are tools. For hunting, for protection against wolves and worse. Could you learn?" "Yes, sir." "Even if it meant killing, butchering? Blood and death are part of ranch life, boy." Thomas swallowed hard but didn't back down. "If it means protecting my mother and sister, keeping them fed and safe, then yes, I could learn." It was a good answer, honest without being boastful.
Eli found himself remembering his own first kill, a rabbit for the pot when he was about Thomas's age, his hand shaking as he skinned it, determined not to waste any part of the animal that had died to keep him alive. The sun was getting lower, painting longer shadows across the ground. Soon, they'd need to head back to town before dark made the journey treacherous. Decision time had arrived whether Eli was ready or not. "1-month trial," he said abruptly. "You work. I provide room and board. After a month, we reassess. If it's not working, I'll pay your stage fare to wherever you want to go next. If it is working, we negotiate terms for the winter." Miriam stood very still, as if afraid movement might make him reconsider. "That's fair?" "I have supplies to pick up tomorrow. If you're serious about this, be ready at dawn. I don't wait." "We'll be ready. You'll need warmer clothes. Winter comes fast here." "We'll manage." "And Mrs. Hayes?" He waited until she met his eyes. "That question you asked earlier about wanting a wife or another winter alone, don't ask it again. This is business. Nothing more." She nodded, but there was something in her expression that suggested she heard what he wasn't saying as clearly as what he was. "Understood, Mr. Grant. Business." He should have left then, mounted his horse, and ridden back to his empty ranch to prepare for the invasion of his carefully ordered life. But something held him there, watching as Miriam gathered her children, as Thomas picked up their bags with renewed energy, as Clara carefully tucked her quartz treasure into her pocket. "Mr. Grant?" Miriam said as they prepared to start the walk back to town. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen the ranch, haven't lived through a Montana winter, haven't discovered all the ways this could go wrong." "No," she agreed, "but I've discovered one way it could go right, and that's more than I had this morning." She began walking, her children beside her, leaving Eli standing by his horse. He watched them go, 3 figures against the vast Montana sky, small but determined, fragile but resilient. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was a mistake, that he was opening his life to complications he'd spent years avoiding. But another part, a part he'd thought buried with other foolish notions, whispered that maybe complications weren't always disasters. Maybe sometimes they were opportunities dressed in difficult clothing. As he mounted his horse, Eli caught himself thinking about the empty bedrooms in his house, the silent dinners, the long winters where the wind was his only conversation partner. He thought about Clara's delight over a piece of quartz, Thomas's determination to protect his family, Miriam's unflinching honesty about survival and dignity. Do you want a wife, or just another winter alone? He still didn't have an answer to her question. But for the first time in years, he was willing to admit he might be tired of the silence. And that admission, small as it was, felt like the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. The ride back to the ranch was familiar, every rise and dip of the land known to him like the lines on his own hands. But tonight, something felt different. The house, when it came into view, looked smaller than usual, more isolated. The lamp he'd left burning in the kitchen window seemed less like a beacon and more like a question. What was he really coming home to? He tended to his horse, taking longer than necessary, delaying the moment when he'd have to enter the empty house and face the reality of what he'd just agreed to. 3 strangers would be living under his roof by tomorrow night. 3 people who would need things from him: food, shelter, protection, perhaps even kindness. The thought terrified him more than any wolf or winter storm ever had. Inside, the house felt expectant, as if it knew change was coming. Eli moved through his evening routine, stoking the fire, heating leftover stew, checking that windows and doors were secure. But his mind kept drifting to the encounter by the creek, to Miriam Hayes' steady gaze and brutal honesty. She hadn't tried to charm him. hadn't fluttered her eyelashes or promised to make him happy or pretended to be anything other than what she was, a desperate woman making rational choices for survival. It was that rationality that unsettled him most. He could have resisted tears, manipulation, even seduction, but clear-eyed pragmatism that matched his own? That was harder to defend against. He found himself standing in the doorway of one of the empty bedrooms, imagining it occupied. Clara's small form in the bed, perhaps, with her cloth doll. Miriam in the chair by the window, mending by lamplight. The image formed too easily, as if the room had been waiting for such a scene. "It's just business," he said aloud, his voice harsh in the silence. "A practical arrangement, nothing more." But even as he spoke the words, he knew he was trying to convince himself of something that was already becoming untrue. Because a purely business arrangement wouldn't have him wondering if Clara liked stories before bed, or if Thomas knew how to fish, or if Miriam's hair looked different when it wasn't pinned up under a travel-worn bonnet. He closed the bedroom door firmly and retreated to his own room, but sleep didn't come easily. Instead, he lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the wind testing the windows, the distant howl of wolves in the mountains. Tomorrow, these sounds would be joined by others, footsteps, voices, life. For 10 years, he'd protected himself from the possibility of loss by refusing the possibility of gain. It had worked in its way. He'd built a successful ranch, earned respect if not friendship, created a life that demanded nothing from him that he wasn't willing to give. But Miriam Hayes had walked into town and asked a simple question that revealed the complex lie he'd been living. He didn't want a wife. That much was true. The very word carried weight he wasn't ready to bear. Promises, intimacy, vulnerability, all the things that had burned him before and left scars he still carried. But another winter alone? That prospect, which had once seemed like safety, now felt like something else. A prison of his own making, perhaps. Or a slow death by isolation, so gradual he'd hardly noticed it happening. Dawn would come soon enough, bringing with it 3 people who would disrupt everything he'd built. But as Eli finally drifted toward sleep, he found himself thinking not of the disruption, but of Clara's laugh when she'd found the quartz, of Thomas's earnest promise to learn, of Miriam's hand in his, calloused, strong, unafraid. Maybe he didn't want a wife. Maybe he did want another winter alone. But for the first time in a decade, he wasn't entirely sure. And that uncertainty, terrifying as it was, felt oddly like the first crack in ice that had frozen too thick for too long. Whether that crack would lead to drowning or to spring remained to be seen, but at least something was finally moving in the stillness he'd mistaken for peace. Tomorrow would bring them to his door. Tomorrow would begin an arrangement that was supposed to be simple business, but already felt like something more dangerous. Tomorrow would test every wall he'd built, every protection he'd put in place, every reason he'd given himself for staying alone. But tonight, in the darkness of his empty house, Eli Grant allowed himself one moment of honesty that he'd never speak aloud. He was tired of the silence, tired of the emptiness, tired of being strong enough to need no one. And maybe, just maybe, that exhaustion was the beginning of a different kind of strength, the kind that could admit weakness, accept help, and possibly, eventually, risk the terrifying possibility of human connection. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows with familiar insistence, but for once, it didn't sound like loneliness. It sounded like change. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the weight of his impulsive decision. Eli stood on his porch, watching the road that led to town, half hoping the Hayes family wouldn't appear. It would be easier if they'd changed their minds, if Miriam had found some other solution in the night. But even as he thought it, he knew she'd be there. Something about that woman suggested she didn't make promises lightly or break them easily. The sound of wheels on hard-packed earth announced their arrival before he could see them. Tom Morrison's wagon appeared around the bend, and Eli felt his chest tighten with a mix of anticipation and dread that he refused to examine too closely. Miriam sat straight-backed beside Tom, Clara on her lap, Thomas in the back with their meager belongings. She'd changed into a different dress, still mended but cleaner, and had attempted to tame her hair into a tighter bun. The effort she'd made somehow made this feel more real, more permanent than any business arrangement should. "Morning, Eli,"
Tom called out, his voice carrying a note of curiosity that suggested he'd be dining out on this story for weeks. Got your delivery here. Mrs. Hayes isn't a delivery, Tom, Eli said curtly, moving forward to help with the bags. Figure of speech, Tom muttered, but he was already climbing down to help Thomas with the small trunk. Miriam descended from the wagon with the same grace she'd shown yesterday, despite Clara's weight in her arms. She set the girl down gently, smoothed her skirts, and met Eli's gaze with that directness he was already beginning to recognize as her trademark. Mr. Grant, we're ready, as promised. So I see. He hefted their trunk, surprised by how light it was. Everything they owned in the world, apparently, weighed less than a season's worth of grain. This everything? Everything that matters, she replied, and there was something in her tone that discouraged further questions. Tom Morrison lingered, clearly hoping for drama or at least gossip-worthy interaction, but Eli's stare sent him back to his wagon. Well then, I'll just, head back to town. You folks need anything, you let me know. We'll be fine, Tom, Eli said firmly. Thanks for the ride. As the wagon disappeared down the road, leaving dust and silence in its wake, the four of them stood in the yard like actors who'd forgotten their lines. Clara had found a stick and was drawing in the dirt again, but her eyes kept darting to the house, taking in its size in isolation. Thomas stood protective near their belongings, his jaw set in that way that suggested he was preparing for disappointment, but hoping for better. I'll show you the house, Eli said, because someone had to break the silence. You can get settled while I see to the morning chores. The tour was brief and businesslike. Kitchen with its large stove and scarred wooden table, parlor that he rarely used, furniture covered in dust sheets like ghosts of a life never lived. The 3 bedrooms as promised, his own, which he passed without opening, and 2 others that had stood empty since he'd built the place, optimistic in those early days about a future that had never materialized. This one's bigger, he said, opening the first door. Thought you and the girl might want it. The bed's solid, mattress is good. There's extra blankets in the chest. Miriam stepped inside, running her hand along the window frame, testing the floorboards with her foot. It's more than adequate. Better than what we've had in years. The boys' room is here, Eli continued, showing Thomas the smaller room next door. Bed might be a bit short for you soon, but it'll do for now. Thomas set down the bags he was carrying and looked around the space like he'd been given a kingdom. It's mine? Just mine? That's the idea. The boy's face transformed with something that might have been joy if it hadn't been so tinged with disbelief. I've never had my own room, always shared with other boarders' kids or slept in the main room. Something twisted in Eli's chest at the simple statement. He'd grown up with his own space, taken it for granted until he'd lost everything else. Well, you've got one now, for as long as... He trailed off, unwilling to remind them all of the temporary nature of this arrangement. Thank you, sir, Thomas said quickly, filling the awkward pause. I'll take good care of it. Kitchen's the main gathering place, Eli continued, leading them back. Breakfast at dawn, dinner at dusk. I take lunch with me when I'm working far from the house. There's a bell on the porch. Ring it if there's trouble. I'll hear it from most parts of the property. Miriam had moved to the stove, checking its condition with practiced efficiency. When were the flues last cleaned? Spring. I do it twice a year. Good. And the pump? Works fine. Freezes occasionally in deep winter, but I keep kettles of water heated just in case. She nodded, already mentally organizing the space. He could tell. Clara had discovered the view from the kitchen window. Miles of rangeland stretching toward the mountains, golden in the morning light. Mama, look, you can see forever. Yes, sweetheart, it's beautiful. Isolating, Eli corrected, not wanting them to romanticize what they were getting into. Nearest neighbor is 3 miles, town's 7. If something goes wrong, we're on our own, Miriam finished. We understand, Mr. Grant. We've been on our own in crowded places too. At least here the isolation is honest. He didn't know what to say to that, so he moved on. Root cellars through that door. Smokehouse out back. Chicken coop's empty now, but if you want birds, we can get some in town. Garden plots on the south side, fallow now, but ready for spring planting if... Again, he stopped himself from finishing the sentence. I'd like to see the root cellar, Miriam said. Take inventory of what's there, what's needed. He showed her down the rough wooden steps into the cool darkness below. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with preserves from previous years, potatoes and onions in bins, carrots buried in sand. It was the cache of a man who'd learned to prepare for isolation, for the possibility that weather or circumstance might cut him off from town for weeks at a time. "You preserve all this yourself?" she asked, lifting a jar of what looked like green beans. "Have to, no one else to do it." "It's well organized, systematic. Survival requires system." She set the jar back carefully in its place. "Yes, it does." She turned to face him in the dim light. "What about milk? Eggs?" "I've got 2 cows for milk, but no chickens currently. Previous flock got taken by a fox last spring. Haven't bothered replacing them. We'll need both for the children. Growing bones need... We can get chickens in town today, if necessary." "That would be helpful." She paused, seeming to gather herself for something. "Mr. Grant, about payment for supplies. Room and board in exchange for work. That was the deal." "Yes, but chickens, extra food for the children, winter clothes, are necessary for you to do the work. Therefore, my expense." His tone brooked no argument. "I'm not running a charity, Mrs. Hayes. If you can't work because you're worried about your children freezing or starving, then you're no use to me. It's a practical investment." She studied him for a long moment in the cellar's dim light. "You're not as cold as you pretend to be, and you're not as tough as you pretend to be. Guess we're both liars. I prefer to think we're both survivors doing what's necessary." She moved past him toward the stairs. "I should start breakfast. I assume you have preferences? Hot, filling, and ready by sunup." "That I can manage." Back in the kitchen, she'd already begun to take charge of the space, directing Thomas to bring water, showing Clara where to set the table. It was strange, watching strangers move through his house like they belonged there. Stranger still how quickly they seemed to be settling into rhythms and routines, as if they'd been desperate for stability for so long that they grabbed onto it the moment it appeared. "I need to see to the stock," Eli said, suddenly needing escape from the domesticity invading his space. "Breakfast in an hour?" "It'll be ready," Miriam assured him, already working at the stove with an efficiency that suggested years of practice. The barn was a relief, familiar and unchanged. The horses nickered in greeting, the cows lowed for their morning grain. Here he knew what was expected of him, what needed doing. No complicated emotions, no dangerous possibilities, just work and animals and the simple exchange of care for service. But even as he went through his routine, he could hear activity from the house, voices, footsteps, the clatter of dishes. Life sounds. The kind of sounds the house had been built for but had never contained. It was unsettling and oddly compelling at the same time. When he returned to the house, the smell of bacon and biscuits hit him like a physical force. The table was set with dishes he'd forgotten he owned, pulled from some cupboard he never opened. Clara sat in her chair, swinging her legs, while Thomas helped his mother with something at the stove. They looked up when he entered, and for a moment the scene was so perfectly domestic that it took his breath away. "Sit," Miriam said, not quite in order but close. "It's ready." The food was simple but good, better than anything he'd made for himself in years. The biscuits were light, the eggs cooked perfectly, the bacon crisp without being burned. But it was the coffee that surprised him most, strong and smooth, without the bitter edge his always seemed to have. "This is good," he said, the words pulled from him almost involuntarily. "Thank you," Miriam replied, but her attention was on Clara, cutting the girl's food into smaller pieces. "Thomas, eat slower. You'll make yourself sick." "Sorry, Mama. It's really good, and there's so much." The boys' wonder at a simple breakfast told Eli more about their recent circumstances than any explanation could have. He found himself pushing the plate of bacon closer to Thomas. "Growing boy needs fuel. Eat what you want." Thomas looked at his mother for permission, and at her nod took 2 more pieces with reverence usually reserved for church services. After breakfast, Eli said, addressing Thomas, "You come with me. Need to show you the daily chores. See what you can handle." "Yes, sir. I'm ready." "It's hard work." "I'm not afraid of hard work." "We'll see." But the boy proved true to his word. He listened carefully as Eli explained the feeding routine, the water requirements, how to check for injuries or illness in the stock. His hands were soft and uncertain with the tools, but he didn't complain when blisters formed almost immediately. When one of the horses tested him, pushing against him to see if he'd yield, Thomas stood his ground even though fear flickered in his eyes. "Good," Eli said. "Show them you're not afraid, even when you are. Especially when you are." "Is that what you do?" Thomas asked, then immediately looked stricken. "Sorry, sir. I shouldn't." "It's what everyone does, boy. Every day. The trick is not letting the fear make your decisions for you." They worked in companionable silence after that, Thomas shadowing Eli's movements, learning through observation more than instruction. The boy was quick, Eli had to admit. He might not know ranch work yet, but he understood the concept of work itself, the rhythm of task after task that kept a place running. When they returned for the midday meal, they found Miriam had transformed the kitchen, not just cleaned it, but somehow made it warmer, more welcoming. She'd uncovered things Eli had forgotten existed. A tablecloth his mother had embroidered, cushions for the hard wooden chairs, curtains he'd taken down years ago because they seemed pointless for windows no one looked through. "I hope you don't mind," she said, noting his survey of the changes. They were in the trunk in the parlor. Seemed ashamed to leave them hidden. He wanted to tell her to put them back, that he'd packed those things away for reasons, that their presence brought back memories he'd rather leave buried. But Clara was sitting on one of the cushioned chairs, looking more comfortable than she had since arrival, and Thomas was eyeing the curtains with interest, as if a softened room meant a softened life. "It's fine," he said instead. The afternoon brought a trip to town for supplies. Eli had planned to go alone, but Miriam insisted she needed to choose the chickens herself and select fabric for winter clothes. So they all went, the four of them in the wagon like a family, which set Eli's teeth on edge even as he acknowledged the practical necessity. Town received them with barely concealed fascination. Women stopped their shopping to stare. Men found reasons to loiter near the wagon. Eli could feel their curiosity like ants on his skin. But Miriam seemed unbothered. She conducted her business with calm efficiency, selecting 6 laying hens and a rooster, examining fabric with Clara, helping Thomas pick out a winter coat that had room to grow into. "Folks are talking," Tom Morrison said quietly to Eli while Miriam haggled with Mrs. Chen over the price of wool fabric. "Folks always talk." "They're saying you've taken a wife." "They're wrong." Tom looked skeptical. Man doesn't usually bring a woman to town to buy chickens unless there's something permanent about the arrangement. "It's business, Tom. She works. I provide room and board. Nothing more." "If you say so." Tom's tone suggested he didn't believe a word of it. "Though I've got to say, she doesn't look at you like it's just business." Eli turned to see what Tom meant and caught Miriam watching him from across the store. Their eyes met and held for a moment before she turned back to her negotiations. There had been something in that look, not romantic exactly, but assessing, thoughtful, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't expected to encounter. "And you don't look at her like it's just business either," Tom added with a knowing grin. "Mind your own affairs, Tom." But Tom's words stuck with him as they loaded the wagon, as they drove home through the afternoon light with Clara chattering about the chickens and Thomas asking questions about the ranch. He found himself noticing things he shouldn't, the way Miriam tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the way she absently comforted Clara with a hand on her shoulder, the way she watched the landscape with appreciation rather than the fear or disappointment he'd expected. That evening, as Miriam prepared dinner with Clara's enthusiastic but clumsy help, and Thomas practiced the knots Eli had shown him for securing gates, Eli found himself standing in his own doorway like a stranger, watching a life he didn't recognize unfold in his house. It had been less than a day, but already the emptiness had been filled with something he couldn't quite name. "Mr. Grant?" Miriam called. "Dinner's ready." He joined the men at the table, accepting the plate she handed him, listening to Clara's story about the chickens pecking her fingers, watching Thomas demonstrate his new knot-tying skills with a piece of rope. It was loud after years of silence, chaotic after years of order. It should have been unbearable. But when Miriam laughed at something Clara said, a real laugh, not the careful smiles she'd worn like armor since arrival, Eli found himself thinking that maybe unbearable had been the silence, not this. Maybe he'd simply gotten so used to the emptiness that he'd forgotten it was supposed to hurt. "Mr. Grant," Thomas was saying. "Sir?"
Eli realized they were all looking at him, waiting for something. Sorry, what? I asked if you'd teach me to shoot tomorrow. If there's time, I mean. If it's not too much trouble. The boy was eager, but trying not to show it. Hope battled with the expectation of disappointment. Eli recognized the look. He'd worn it himself at that age, wanting so badly, but preparing for the inevitable no. After morning chores, he heard himself say, if your mother approves. Miriam nodded. He needs to learn. Out here, it's necessary. It's not easy, Eli warned Thomas. Taking a life, even in animals, changes something in you. I understand, sir, but if it means protecting family, providing food, then it's a change worth making. The boy's maturity, forced by circumstances no child should face, reminded Eli again of himself. He wondered if that was why he'd agreed to this arrangement. Not for the help, not for the cooking and cleaning, but because he saw in Thomas the boy he'd been and maybe wanted to provide what no one had provided for him. Guidance, stability, a chance to grow strong without growing hard. After dinner, Miriam insisted on cleaning up alone, sending the children to prepare for bed. Eli found himself lingering in the kitchen, watching her work. She moved with economy of motion, no wasted effort, but there was grace in it too. You can go, she said without turning around. I don't need supervision. I'm not supervising. Then what are you doing? He didn't have an answer for that, so he said nothing. She continued washing dishes, the silence stretching between them, but not uncomfortably. Finally, she spoke again. The children are happy, happier than I've seen them in 2 years. It's only been a day. Sometimes a day is enough to know whether a place is safe or not. She dried her hands on her apron, turning to face him. This place feels safe. It's isolated, hard, dangerous when winter comes. But safe, she interrupted. You won't hurt us, physically or otherwise. You won't disappear into a bottle or a card game. You won't make promises you don't intend to keep. Do you know how rare that is, Mr. Grant? Do you know what that kind of safety means to people who haven't had it? He thought of his own childhood, the uncertainty, the broken promises, the gradual learning that the only person he could rely on was himself. Maybe. Then you understand why the children are happy, why I'm... She paused, seeming to search for words. Grateful. Despite the temporary nature of our arrangement. About that, he began, but she held up a hand. No, we agreed to a month trial, then reassessment. Let's not complicate it with premature negotiations or promises neither of us is ready to make. She moved past him toward the stairs. Good night, Mr. Grant. He watched her go, then stood alone in his kitchen that no longer felt quite like his kitchen. The dishes were done, the table wiped clean, the stove banked for the night. Everything in its place, but somehow completely different. The house even smelled different, soap and bread and the faint scent of lavender from whatever Miriam had used to wash her hair. Eli did his final check of the property, securing gates, checking the animals one last time. The new chickens were settled in their coop, already establishing their pecking order. The horses seemed calm, the cows content. Everything was as it should be, except for the light showing under the door of what he'd already started thinking of as Clara's and Miriam's room. He paused outside, hearing Miriam's voice, low and soothing, telling some kind of story. Clara's giggle punctuated the narrative, followed by a question he couldn't quite make out. Then Miriam's voice again, patient and warm. It was such a maternal sound, such a family sound, that it made something ache in his chest. In his own room, Eli sat on the edge of his bed and tried to make sense of the day. He'd woken up prepared for an awkward business arrangement, a temporary solution to winter's approaching challenges. But what had unfolded felt like something else entirely. Not romantic, not yet, maybe never, but something, a possibility. A door opened to a room he'd convinced himself he never wanted to enter. Through the walls, he could hear the house settling into sleep. Thomas moving around his room, probably examining every corner of his new domain. Miriam's footsteps, soft but purposeful. Clara's voice. One more question before sleep. Normal sounds, family sounds, the kind of sounds this house had been waiting for since he'd built it with foolish hope a decade ago. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Teaching Thomas to shoot, figuring out how to maintain boundaries with people living in his space, dealing with town gossip and his own discomfort with change. Winter was coming with all its hardships and isolation. The arrangement could still fail, probably would fail, leaving everyone disappointed and him alone again. But tonight, for the first time in years, the house didn't echo with emptiness. Tonight, there were people under his roof who needed what he could provide, and who provided something in return he hadn't realized he needed. Tonight, the silence that had been his companion and shield was broken by the breathing of sleeping children and the soft movements of a woman preparing for bed. It wasn't what he'd planned. It wasn't what he'd wanted. But as sleep finally took him, Eli found himself thinking that maybe what we plan and what we want aren't always what we need. Maybe sometimes life sends us exactly what we've been avoiding, disguised as exactly what we can handle. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't the disaster he'd always assumed it would be. The moon rose over the ranch, casting silver light across the buildings and the land beyond. Inside, 4 people slept in what had been one man's fortress against the world. The walls were still standing, but something had shifted. A door had opened, and through it, despite all resistance and reason, life had found its way in. The first week passed in a blur of adjustments and small negotiations. Thomas's hands blistered and healed and blistered again as he learned the rhythm of ranch work. Clara had named each chicken and insisted on gathering eggs herself each morning, despite the rooster's aggressive pecking. And Miriam moved through the house like she'd always belonged there, finding things Eli had forgotten existed, creating order where he'd only maintained function. It was the shooting lesson that changed something fundamental between Eli and Thomas. The boy stood in the field behind the barn, holding the rifle like it might bite him, his whole body tense with expectation. "Relax," Eli said, adjusting Thomas's stance. "The gun's a tool, nothing more. Respect it, but don't fear it." "Yes, sir." But Thomas's shoulders remained rigid. "What are you afraid of?" Thomas glanced at him, then back at the target Eli had set up, a piece of wood with a circle drawn in charcoal. "My father said guns were for weak men who couldn't solve problems with words or wisdom." "Your father was a clerk in a city," Eli said, not unkindly. "Out here, words don't stop a wolf from taking your chickens. Wisdom doesn't put meat on the table when winter runs long." "I know, it's just—" Thomas lowered the rifle slightly. "What if I'm no good at it? What if I can't protect them when it matters?" The vulnerability in the boy's voice touched something Eli had thought calcified beyond feeling. He remembered his own first lesson, his uncle's harsh criticism when he'd missed, the desperate need to prove he could be useful, valuable, worth keeping around. "Thomas," he said, and waited until the boy met his eyes. "Being good at something isn't about natural talent. It's about practice, patience, and purpose. You've got the purpose, protecting your family. The rest will come." "How do you know?" "A piece of wood with a circle drawn in charcoal. My father said guns were for weak men who couldn't solve problems with words or wisdom." "Your father was a clerk in a city," Eli said, not unkindly. "Out here, words don't stop a wolf from taking your chickens. Wisdom doesn't put meat on the table when winter runs long." "I know, it's just—" Thomas lowered the rifle slightly. "What if I'm no good at it? What if I can't protect them when it matters?" The vulnerability in the boy's voice touched something Eli had thought calcified beyond feeling. He remembered his own first lesson, his uncle's harsh criticism when he'd missed, the desperate need to prove he could be useful, valuable, worth keeping around. "Thomas," he said, and waited until the boy met his eyes. "Being good at something isn't about natural talent. It's about practice, patience, and purpose. You've got the purpose, protecting your family. The rest will come." "How do you know?" "Because you're here at dawn asking to learn, despite what your father taught you. That's not weakness, boy. That's growth." Thomas straightened slightly, raising the rifle again. This time, when he squeezed the trigger, his stance was solid. The shot went wide, but not by much. "Better," Eli said. "Again." They spent 2 hours in the field until Thomas's shoulder was sore from the rifle's kick and his grouping had tightened to something respectable. When they walked back to the house, the boy carried himself differently. Still young, still uncertain, but with a new edge of capability. Miriam was hanging laundry, Clara helping by handing her clothespins. She looked up as they approached, her eyes immediately going to Thomas, reading his expression. "How did it go?" she asked carefully. "He's a quick study," Eli said before Thomas could answer. "Few more weeks of practice, he'll be able to hunt small game." The pride that bloomed on Thomas's face was matched by something in Miriam's expression. Relief, maybe, or recognition that her son was crossing a bridge from boyhood to something harder but necessary. "There's lunch keeping warm," she said. "And Mr. Grant, the fence by the chicken coop needs attention. The posts are rotting at the base." He bristled slightly at being given directions in his own property, but she was right. He'd been putting off that repair for months. "I'll get to it." Thomas could help, she suggested. "After lunch." The boy looked between them eagerly. "I'd like to learn, sir." And so the afternoon was spent teaching Thomas about post holes and proper depth, about drainage and wood treatment. The boy's enthusiasm made up for his inexperience, and by evening they'd replaced 2 posts and reinforced 3 others. At dinner, Thomas could barely contain his excitement as he told his mother and Clara about the day's work. "Mr. Grant says if the posts aren't deep enough, the frost will heave them come winter. And you have to char the bottom of the wood to prevent rot. And—" "Thomas," Miriam said gently, "let Mr. Grant eat his dinner while it's hot." But Eli found he didn't mind the chatter. After years of silent meals, the noise was oddly comforting. Even Clara contributed, describing in detail how one hen, she'd named it Buttercup, had chased the rooster around the coop. "She's establishing dominance," Eli found himself explaining. "Sometimes the hens get tired of the rooster's behavior and put him in his place." Clara giggled, "Like Mama does with the men who get too friendly at the general store." Miriam's face colored slightly. "Clara, that's not—" "It's true," Clara insisted. "That man last week said you were pretty, and you told him pretty doesn't put food on the table or character in the soul." Thomas snorted into his milk. Eli found himself fighting a smile. "Sounds like good advice." "Mr. Grant doesn't think Mama's pretty," Clara continued with the devastating honesty of children. "He never says nice things like the other men do." The silence that followed was deafening. Miriam's color deepened, and she suddenly became very interested in cutting her meat into precise pieces. Thomas looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. "Clara," Miriam said quietly, "finish your dinner." "But it's true. Mr. Sawyer said you had eyes like summer sky, and Mr. Wallace said you were like a flower in the desert, but Mr. Grant just says dinner's good, or that fence work is solid." Eli set down his fork. "Your mother doesn't need empty compliments, Clara. She needs respect and fair treatment. Pretty words don't mean much when winter comes." "So, you don't think she's pretty?" Clara pressed with 7-year-old persistence. He looked at Miriam then, really looked at her. She was watching him with that direct gaze that had unsettled him from the start, waiting for his answer without seeming to care what it might be. Her hair had come loose from its pins, framing her face in soft waves. There was flour on her sleeve and a smudge of something, jam, maybe, on her apron. She looked tired and real, and somehow more appealing than any dressed-up woman he'd ever seen. "I think your mother is—" He paused, searching for words that were honest but not revealing. "Capable. And capability is worth more than pretty." It wasn't what Clara wanted to hear, judging by her frown, but something flickered in Miriam's eyes that might have been appreciation or understanding, or maybe both. Later, after the children were in bed, Eli found Miriam on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. She was staring out at the darkening landscape, her expression thoughtful. "I apologize for Clara," she said without turning. "She doesn't understand boundaries yet." "No need for apologies. She's a child. Still, she shouldn't put you in uncomfortable positions." He leaned against the porch rail, maintaining careful distance. "You want to know something funny? She's not wrong. Pete Sawyer probably did compare your eyes to summer sky. Ben Wallace definitely seems the type to talk about flowers in the desert." "And you?" There was something in her voice he couldn't identify. "What type are you?" "The type that notices when someone's capable, when they do what needs doing without complaint or dramatics, when they make a house feel—" He stopped, catching himself before he said too much. "Feel what?" "Different." She turned to look at him then, the moonlight catching her face. "Is different good or bad?" "Don't know yet." "Fair enough." She pulled the shawl tighter. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded, though questions from her had proven dangerous to his peace of mind. "Why did you really say yes?" "To taking us in?" He could have given her the practical answer, needed help for winter, made business sense, temporary arrangement. All true, all safe. But something about the darkness and her quiet presence made him more honest than wise. Because you didn't cry. Every other woman who's approached me eventually cried. Tears of frustration, manipulation, genuine emotion, doesn't matter. They all cried. You didn't. I don't cry anymore, she said simply. Used up all my tears the night Robert died. Nothing since then has been worth that kind of water. That's a hard way to live, says the man who's made isolation an art form. He almost smiled. Touché. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke again. Thomas is happy, happier than I've seen him since his father died. You're good with him. He's a good kid, eager to learn. It's more than that. You treat him like he's capable of becoming a man, not like he's a burden or a charity case. That matters. Every boy needs to know he can be useful, that he has value beyond what others give him. Speaking from experience? Maybe. She turned back to the landscape. I won't let them get too attached. I know this is temporary, but thank you for giving them this, even briefly. Something in her resignation bothered him. You're so sure it's temporary? Aren't you? You made it very clear. 1-month trial, reassess, no promises. That was the agreement. And you're a man who keeps his agreements, aren't you? No messy emotions, no complications, just clean business. There was no accusation in her tone, just observation, but it stung anyway. Because she was right. That's exactly what he'd wanted, what he'd insisted on. So why did hearing her accept it so easily make him feel like he'd lost something? It's getting cold, he said instead of addressing her statement. You should go inside. In a minute. She paused, then added, You know what's funny? Claire's right. You never do say pretty things. But today, when you told Thomas he had purpose, when you taught him about fence posts like it was important wisdom, when you explained chicken behavior to Clara like her observations mattered, those were the prettiest words I've heard in years. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone on the porch with thoughts he didn't want to examine. The night was full of familiar sounds. Wind through grass, distant coyotes, the settling of buildings. But underneath it all, he could hear the new sounds too, the soft footsteps of Miriam preparing for bed. The creak of Thomas's bed as the boy shifted in sleep, Clara's small cough from her room. His house was full of life, and it terrified him. The second week brought unexpected challenges. A storm rolled in from the mountains, sudden and vicious, catching them all off guard. Eli and Thomas were checking the far pasture when the sky darkened to an ominous green-black. Run! Eli shouted over the rising wind. Now! They barely made it to the house before the hail started, chunks of ice the size of walnuts pelting the ground with violence. Miriam had already brought the chickens into the barn and secured everything she could. Clara stood at the window, watching with wide eyes as the world turned white and hostile. Away from the window, Eli ordered, pulling her back just as a particularly large hailstone cracked against the glass. They huddled in the kitchen as the storm raged, the house shuddering under the assault. Clara pressed against her mother, trying to be brave but clearly frightened. Thomas stood near Eli, as if proximity to strength might make him stronger. It'll pass, Eli said. These storms are fierce but fast. Does this happen often? Miriam asked, her arm around Clara. Few times a year. This one's earlier than usual. A particularly violent gust shook the house, and something crashed outside. Clara whimpered. Hey, Eli said, surprising himself by kneeling beside the girl. Want to know a secret? She nodded, eyes still wide. The house sounds angry, doesn't it? All that creaking and groaning? Another nod. That's not anger, that's the house being strong. Every sound means it's doing its job, flexing but not breaking, keeping us safe. My grandfather taught me that. He said a quiet house in a storm is a weak house. A noisy house is a fighter. Really? Clara's voice was small but interested. Really? Listen. They all fell silent, hearing the house's protests against the wind. Hear that beam creaking? That's the main support, holding everything together. And that rattling? That's the window staying sealed, keeping the storm out. Clara listened intently, and Eli saw her fear gradually replaced by fascination. It's like the house is talking. Exactly. And what's it saying? She thought for a moment. It's saying,
I won't let you down. That's right. Miriam was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. When their eyes met, she mouthed, "Thank you," silently. He looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude, with the warmth it generated in his chest. The storm passed within an hour, leaving damage in its wake. The chicken coop roof had partially collapsed, one of the barn doors was hanging by a single hinge, and the garden plot Miriam had just started preparing was destroyed. "Well," Miriam said, surveying the damage with her typical pragmatism, "at least we're all safe." They spent the rest of the day on repairs. Thomas worked beside Eli on the barn door, while Miriam and Clara salvaged what they could from the garden and reinforced the chicken coop temporarily. By evening, everyone was exhausted, muddy, and somehow closer than they'd been that morning. "You did good today," Eli told Thomas as they washed up for dinner. "Kept your head, worked hard, didn't complain." "I was scared," Thomas admitted, when the storm hit. "Being scared is normal. Working despite the fear is what matters." "Were you scared?" Eli considered lying, then decided the boy deserved honesty. "Some. More concerned than scared. I've seen storms kill livestock, destroy buildings, ruin entire harvests. But fear doesn't fix anything. Work does." At dinner, Clara regaled them with her version of the storm, complete with the house's brave fight against the wind. Miriam had somehow produced a meal from limited resources, the storm having prevented proper cooking. But no one complained. There was something about surviving a crisis together that made even simple food taste better. "Mr. Grant," Clara said suddenly, "if the house can talk, what does it say when there's no storm?" He should have dismissed it as childish fancy, but her earnest expression stopped him. "What do you think it says?" She scrunched up her face, thinking. "Before we came, I think it was lonely. It probably said, 'Where is everybody?' But now it's happy. It says, 'Finally.'" Thomas rolled his eyes. "Houses don't have feelings, Clara." "They do too." She looked to Eli for support. "Don't they, Mr. Grant?" He thought about his house, empty for so long, built for a family that never materialized. "Maybe they do," he said quietly. "Maybe they do." Later that evening, he found himself working on a proper repair for the chicken coop while Miriam helped, holding boards as he nailed them. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared labor and growing familiarity. "You were good with Clara today," she said eventually. "During the storm." She was scared. So was I. The admission seemed to surprise her. "I'm not used to storms like that. In the city, buildings buffer the wind. Here, it feels like the world might blow away. But you didn't show it. Neither did you." "I've had practice." She handed him another board. "Can I ask you something personal?" He tensed. "You can ask." "Who hurt you? Who made you decide being alone was safer than the alternative?" The hammer paused mid-swing. He could have refused to answer, should have refused, but something about the darkness, the shared work, her matter-of-fact tone, made him consider it. "My fiancée, Elizabeth. 8 years ago." The words felt rusty, unused. "We were going to marry in the spring. I was building this house for us. Then a cattle buyer came through town, wealthy, charming, heading to San Francisco. She left with him. No explanation, no goodbye. Just gone." Miriam absorbed this quietly. "That's why you built such a big house. You were planning for a family. Young men make foolish plans. Or hopeful ones." "Same thing." She disagreed, but didn't argue. "Is that why you turn women away? Afraid they'll leave too?" "No, I turn them away because they want something I can't give anymore." "Which is?" "Trust, faith, the ability to believe in permanent things." He set down the hammer. "I can offer shelter, food, protection, respect, but not that." She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Good thing I'm not asking for any of that then." But there was something in her voice that suggested maybe she was starting to want to, and that scared him more than any storm. The third week brought a different kind of challenge. Pete Sawyer rode out from town, ostensibly to check on storm damage, but really to see the domestic arrangement everyone was gossiping about. "Well, well," Pete said, dismounting with theatrical flair, "the rumors are true. Eli Grant's got himself a woman." Mrs. Hayes is employed here, Eli said curtly.
Nothing more. Pete's eyes traveled to where Miriam was working in the garden with Clara, both of them muddy and laughing about something. Employed. Right. That why she's wearing your mother's garden hat? Eli hadn't even noticed, but Pete was right. Miriam had found his mother's old sun hat somewhere and was wearing it as naturally as if it had always been hers. The sight did something complicated to his chest. What do you want, Pete? Just neighborly concern. Pete's grin was sly. Making sure you haven't been taken advantage of by a pretty widow. Mrs. Hayes isn't... Eli stopped, realizing he'd been about to defend her honor like some lovesick fool. Isn't what? Pretty? Pete laughed. Even you can't be that blind, Eli. Woman like that, working your land, cooking your food, raising those kids under your roof? That's not employment, friend, that's family. It's temporary. If you say so. Pete's expression grew more serious. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you're not paying attention. Trust me, I know. My temporary help stayed for 30 years. Called her my wife, though. Before Eli could respond, Thomas appeared from the barn. Mr. Grant, sir, the mare's favoring her left front leg. Should I... Oh, hello, Mr. Sawyer. Thomas, Pete said with surprise. Boy, you've filled out some. Ranch work agrees with you. Thomas stood straighter, pride evident. Yes, sir. Mr. Grant's been teaching me. Has he now? Pete looked between them with interest. And what's he taught you? Everything, sir. How to mend fences, tend stock, shoot, track, read weather signs. Yesterday he showed me how to tell if a cow's about to calve by the way she holds her tail. The enthusiasm in Thomas's voice was unmistakable, as was the hero worship when he looked at Eli. Pete's eyebrows rose. Sounds like Eli's got himself an apprentice. The boy's a quick learner, Eli said uncomfortably. The boy's standing right here thinking you might be replacing him, Pete said shrewdly. That why you're really here? Trying to hire away my help? What? No, Pete laughed. I'm joking, Eli. Though if you weren't so set on this temporary nonsense, you'd have yourself a fine setup here. Good woman, strong boy to help with the ranch, sweet little girl to remind you why the work matters. Man could do worse. Pete, I'm going. Pete mounted his horse. But Eli, take some advice from someone who waited too long to see what was in front of him. Temporary is just fear dressed up as practicality, and fear's a cold bedfellow come winter. He rode off, leaving Eli standing with Thomas, who was looking at him uncertainly. I wouldn't leave, Thomas said quietly. Even if Mr. Sawyer offered, I like it here. It's temporary, Thomas. Your mother explained that, right? She said it might be, but maybe it doesn't have to be. The hope in the boy's voice was painful. We're helpful, aren't we? Mama keeps the house nice, and I'm learning everything you teach me, and even Clara helps with the chickens. We could stay, if you wanted. It's not that simple. Why not? Thomas's young face was earnest. We don't eat much, and we work hard, and we don't cause trouble. What else matters? Eli wanted to explain about walls built from hurt, about the danger of caring, about the inevitability of loss. But looking at Thomas's eager face, he couldn't bring himself to destroy that hope. Not yet. Check on the mare, he said instead. Might need a poultice if she's pulled something. Thomas nodded and headed back to the barn, but not before Eli heard him mutter, Adults make everything complicated. The boy wasn't wrong. That evening brought an unexpected test of their arrangement. Clara developed a fever, sudden and fierce. One moment she was playing with her doll, the next she was burning up and delirious. Miriam tried to stay calm, but Eli could see the fear in her eyes as she bathed Clara's face with cool water. It's too fast, she kept saying. Fevers don't come on this fast unless... Unless what? Unless it's something serious. Scarlet fever, maybe, or worse. Eli didn't hesitate. I'll ride for the doctor. It's dark, and the storm damaged the roads. I know the way blind. He was already pulling on his coat. Thomas, keep bringing your mother fresh water. Cool, not cold. There's willow bark tea in the pantry. Make some. Weak. It'll help with the fever. Yes, sir. Thomas was pale but steady. Eli rode hard through the darkness, pushing his horse to dangerous speeds on uncertain ground. The 7 miles to town felt like 70. He told himself he wouldn't care, couldn't care, But the image of Clara's flushed face and Miriam's desperate eyes drove him forward like spurs. Doctor. Watson was none too pleased to be woken, but he came, grumbling about wild rides and hysteric mothers. But when he saw Clara, his expression grew serious. How long has she been like this? 2 hours, Miriam said. Maybe less. The doctor examined Clara thoroughly, while Eli stood in the doorway, feeling useless. Thomas sat beside his mother, holding her hand. It's not scarlet fever, Dr. Watson finally announced. Looks like severe reaction to something. She eat anything unusual? Miriam shook her head, then stopped. Wait, she was playing by the creek earlier. She likes to collect berries. Oh God, the pokeweed berries. I told her never to eat them, but that'll do it, the doctor said. Poison, but probably not fatal if she didn't eat many. She throw up any? Earlier, yes. Good. Her body's fighting it. Keep her cool, lots of water when she can take it. She'll be sick as a dog for a day or two, but she should recover. The relief in the room was palpable. Miriam sagged against Thomas, who put his arm around her with touching protectiveness. Eli found himself leaning against the doorframe, only then realizing how tense he'd been. You rode hard, the doctor observed, looking at Eli with interest. For employed help's child. The child needed a doctor. Uh-huh. Dr. Watson packed his bag. Funny how employed help's children become the child when they're sick, almost like you care. Send me your bill, Eli said curtly. Oh, I will. And Eli, this kind of caring, it's not a weakness, it's what makes us human. After the doctor left, Miriam insisted on sitting up with Clara. Eli sent Thomas to bed, then found himself keeping vigil with her, bringing fresh water, making tea, just being present. Around 3 a.m, Clara's fever broke. She opened her eyes, confused but lucid. Mama? I'm here, sweetheart. Miriam's voice broke with relief. Did I miss dinner? Miriam laughed through tears she'd finally allowed to fall. Yes, but we'll make you something special for breakfast. Clara's eyes found Eli. Mr. Grant? Are you angry? Why would I be angry? I ate the berries you said not to eat. He moved closer, surprising himself by reaching out to smooth her damp hair. I'm not angry, just glad you're okay. Me too, she yawned. The house was worried. I could hear it creaking, all concerned-like. The house and all of us, he said softly. Clara smiled sleepily and drifted back to sleep, this time peaceful and natural. Miriam stayed beside her, holding her hand. Thank you, she said to Eli, for writing for the doctor, for staying, for... She gestured helplessly. For caring when you didn't have to. She's a child. Of course He stopped, hearing what he was admitting. It's okay, Miriam said gently. Caring doesn't obligate you to anything. It just means you're human. That's what the doctor said. Smart man. They sat in silence, watching Clara sleep. The crisis had stripped away pretense, leaving something raw and real between them. Not romance, not yet, but connection. The kind forged in fear and relief and shared vigilance. Eli? Miriam used his first name for the first time. The month trial is almost up. I know. What are you thinking? He was thinking that the house no longer felt empty, that Thomas looked at him like he mattered, that Clara's laugh had become essential to his mornings, that Miriam's presence had made him realize how cold his life had been. But he couldn't say any of that. I'm thinking winter's coming, he said instead. Be foolish to make changes with the cold approaching. So, we stay? Through winter, then reassess in spring. She nodded, accepting the extended reprieve. That's practical. That's what I am, practical. No, she said softly, looking at him with those direct eyes that saw too much. You're scared. There's a difference. She was right, of course. He was terrified. Of caring, of loss, of the vulnerability that came with letting people matter. But sitting there in the lamplight, watching over a sick child who wasn't his, beside a woman who asked for nothing but gave everything, he wondered if maybe being scared was better than being empty. Get some rest, he told Miriam. I'll watch her for a while. You don't have to... I know. Rest anyway. She studied him for a moment, then leaned over and kissed his cheek, so quick and light he might have imagined it.
You're a good man, Eli Grant, even if you don't want to be. She curled up in the chair beside Clara's bed, asleep within minutes. Eli sat watching them both, the woman and child who'd invaded his life, his house, his carefully guarded heart. The month trial was nearly over, but he already knew the verdict. They belonged here. Maybe they always had, and he'd just been keeping their place warm until they arrived.
The house creaked gently around them, and he remembered Clara's words about what it said. Finally, she'd suggested. And sitting there in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by people who'd somehow become his to protect, Eli thought maybe the house and Clara were right. Finally. The weeks that followed Clara's illness marked a shift in the household's rhythm, subtle but undeniable. Eli found himself checking on Clara each morning before his chores, bringing her small treasures from his work. An interesting rock, a bird feather, once a nest that had fallen from the barn rafters. She received each gift with delight that seemed disproportionate to the offering, carefully arranging them on the windowsill by her bed. "You're spoiling her," Miriam said one morning, watching as Clara examined a piece of fool's gold Eli had found by the creek. "It's just a rock," he replied gruffly, but they both knew it was more than that. The first snow came early. October barely ended when the sky released its white burden. Eli had been preparing, checking the roof, reinforcing the barn, laying in extra wood, but he'd been doing it differently this year. Instead of the grim determination of previous winters, there was purpose to his preparations, a sense of providing rather than just surviving. "Thomas," he called to the boy who was mucking stalls, "come help me with something." He led Thomas to the storage room he'd built off the barn, revealing shelves of preserves, smoked meat, sacks of flour, and grain. "This is our winter store. You need to know what we have and where it is, in case something happens to me." Thomas's eyes widened at the bounty. "This could feed a small army. Or a family through a long winter." The word family slipped out before Eli could stop it. He cleared his throat. "Your mother will need to know what's here, too. Make a list. Help her plan meals around what we have." "Yes, sir." Thomas paused. "Mr. Grant, you said in case something happens. Are you planning on something happening?" "No, but winter doesn't care about plans. Man could break a leg, catch fever, get caught in a blizzard. You need to be ready to take care of your mother and sister if needed." "I will," Thomas said, with such fierce determination that Eli had to look away. That evening, the snow fell heavier, transforming the landscape into something pristine and dangerous. They gathered in the kitchen after dinner, the warmest room in the house. Clara was teaching her doll the alphabet, while Thomas worked on the harness Eli had given him to repair. Miriam was darning socks, and Eli found himself pretending to read while actually watching them all. This had become their routine, these evening hours when the work was done and the night stretched ahead. At first, Eli had retreated to his room or the barn, maintaining distance, but gradually, the warmth of the kitchen and the quiet companionship had drawn him in. "Mr. Grant," Clara said suddenly, "will you tell us a story?" "I don't know any stories." "Everyone knows stories," she insisted. "Even true ones count." "Clara, don't pester, Miriam began, but Eli surprised himself by interrupting. "My grandfather used to tell me about the first winter he spent here before Montana was even a territory." Clara immediately abandoned her doll, moving closer. Even Thomas looked up from his work. He came out with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and determination to build something. The first winter caught him unprepared. Snow came early, like today, and he hadn't finished his shelter. Just a half-built cabin with gaps in the walls big enough to throw a cat through. "What did he do?" Clara asked, eyes wide. "He survived. Stuffed the gaps with mud and grass, kept a fire going day and night, ate rabbits when he could catch them, and pine bark soup when he couldn't." "Pine bark soup?" Thomas made a face. "Keeps the scurvy away. Tastes like drinking a tree, but it'll keep you alive." Eli found himself warming to the story, remembering his grandfather's gravelly voice telling it years ago. The worst came in January. Blizzard lasted 5 days. Snow piled so high it covered the door. He had to dig his way out through the roof to feed his horse. "Did the horse survive?" Clara asked anxiously. "She did. Tough little Mustang mare. In fact, that mare's bloodline runs through half our horses now. That bay Thomas has been working with? She's got that Mustang spirit. Really? Thomas's face lit up. The one with the white star. That's the one. Stubborn as her great-great-grandmother, too. They talked about horses then, Thomas asking questions about bloodlines and breeding that showed he'd been paying attention to more than just the daily chores. Clara contributed observations about each horse's personality, surprisingly accurate for someone who barely reached their shoulders. You've got a good eye, Eli told her, and she beamed. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Miriam lingered in the kitchen. That was kind of you, telling them that story. It's just family history. Your family history. That matters. She put away her darning. They're starting to feel like this is home. I know. He should have reminded her it was temporary, but the words wouldn't come. Is that such a bad thing? It is if they get hurt when it ends. What makes you so sure it has to end? He didn't answer, couldn't answer, because he wasn't sure anymore. The certainty he'd carried like armor was developing cracks, and through those cracks something dangerous was growing. Hope. The next morning brought a visitor, though visitor was perhaps too kind a word. Jack Brennan rode up just after breakfast, his presence immediately setting Eli on edge. Brennan owned the neighboring ranch to the east, and he'd had his eye on Eli's water rights for years. Grant, Brennan said without preamble, heard you took in some strays. I hired help for the winter, Eli corrected, though the word hired felt increasingly false. That's so. Brennan's eyes traveled to where Miriam was hanging laundry, the snow having stopped temporarily. Pretty help. State your business, Jack. Just being neighborly, though I wonder what a woman like that sees in an arrangement like this, unless maybe she's hoping for more than wages? The insinuation in his tone made Eli's hands clench. Mrs. Hayes is a respectable woman. Never said she wasn't, just saying winter's long and cold, and proximity has a way of making people, flexible about respectability. You're on my land, Brennan. Say what you came to say or leave. Brennan dismounted, which Eli took as a bad sign. The man only got off his horse when he intended to stay a while or start trouble. Fine. I'll be direct. That water rights dispute we've been having, I'm willing to make a deal. A good one. We don't have a dispute. The water rights are mine, clear and legal. For now, but laws change, especially when the railroad comes through. And it is coming, Grant. Year, maybe 2. They'll need water for the steam engines, and they'll pay well for rights, or they'll take them through eminent domain. Your point? Sell to me now, and I'll give you a fair price, more than fair, enough to set you up somewhere else, maybe closer to town where that pretty widow won't have to work so hard. Eli stepped closer, close enough to smell the whiskey on Brennan's breath despite the early hour. My water rights aren't for sale. Not now, not ever. Everyone has a price, Grant. Even lone wolves who suddenly find themselves with a pack to feed. The reference to Miriam and the children as his pack shouldn't have affected him, but it did, because that's what they were becoming, whether he'd intended it or not. Get off my land, Jack. Brennan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Think about it. Winter's long and accidents happen. Be a shame if something happened to that nice little family you've got there. The threat was veiled but clear. Eli's hand moved to his rifle, propped against the porch rail. You threatening them? Not at all. Just observing that the world's dangerous for women and children alone. Good thing they've got you to protect them. For now. He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Eli standing there with rage and something else. Fear. Not for himself, but for the 3 people who'd become his responsibility. Who was that? Miriam asked, approaching with the empty laundry basket. Jack Brennan, neighbor to the east. He didn't look friendly. He's not. Eli made a decision. I need to teach you to shoot. What? Why? Because Brennan's dangerous and I can't always be here. She studied his face, reading the concern there. He threatened us? Not directly. Men like Brennan never do anything directly, but yes, in his way. Because of me and the children? We've brought you trouble? No. Brennan's been trouble for years, but now... He stopped, not wanting to voice what Brennan had seen, that Eli had something to lose now, something that could be used against him. Now he thinks you care about us, Miriam finished. And that makes you vulnerable. I didn't say...
You didn't have to. She set down the basket. When do we start? The shooting lessons. That afternoon, while Clara napped and Thomas worked on his studies, Eli taught Miriam to handle a rifle. She was a quick learner, her determination overcoming her initial reluctance. I don't like guns, she said, sighting down the barrel as he'd shown her. Neither do I, but liking and needing are different things. She fired, the shot going wide, but not by much. Robert would be appalled. He believed violence was never the answer. Robert lived in a city with laws and lawmen. Out here, sometimes violence is the only answer that keeps you alive. She fired again, closer to the target this time. You're not really talking about Brennan, are you? You're talking about Elizabeth. The name hit him like cold water. What? The woman who left. She was a kind of violence too, wasn't she? Emotional violence. And you decided the only answer was isolation. That's not... But he stopped, because maybe it was true. Maybe all his preparations, his self-sufficiency, his walls, were just responses to a violence he hadn't seen coming. The difference is, Miriam continued, adjusting her stance, Brennan's violence can be stopped with bullets if necessary. But the kind Elizabeth did, that can only be healed by taking another risk. She fired again, this time hitting the target dead center. I think I'm getting the hang of this, she said with quiet satisfaction. That evening at dinner, Thomas was full of questions about Brennan, having overheard enough to be worried. Has he caused trouble before? The boy asked. Some. Nothing I couldn't handle. But now he thinks he can use us against you. Eli looked at Thomas, surprised by his perception. Maybe. We won't let him. I won't let him hurt Mama or Clara. That's my job, Thomas. No, the boy said firmly. It's our job, all of us. We're a... He paused, searching for the right word. A unit. Like soldiers. We protect each other. Clara, who'd been quietly eating, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Brennan sounds mean, but mean people are usually scared people. What's he scared of? Out of the mouths of babes, Eli thought. He's scared of not having enough. Some people are like that. No matter how much they have, they always want more. That's sad, Clara said simply. He must be very lonely. Not everyone who's lonely turns mean, sweetheart, Miriam said gently. No, Clara agreed, looking at Eli. Some people just turn careful. The observation was too astute for a 7-year-old, and Eli found himself once again unsettled by this child's ability to see through his defenses. That night, unable to sleep, Eli walked the perimeter of his property, checking fences and gates more out of restlessness than necessity. The snow had started again, light but steady, covering the world in pristine white that would be unmarked until morning. He thought about Brennan's threat, about vulnerability and protection, about the way Thomas had said our job like it was natural and right. He thought about Miriam's steady hand on the rifle and Clara's innocent wisdom. Mostly, he thought about how the equation of his life had changed without his permission or intention. When he'd agreed to take them in, it had been simple. They needed shelter. He needed help. Business. But somewhere between Clara's illness and Thomas's hero worship, between Miriam's quiet strength and evening stories by the fire, business had become something else. Something that had no clean edges or clear boundaries. Something that made him vulnerable in ways Brennan could exploit, but also in ways that had nothing to do with water rights or property lines. Can't sleep? He turned to find Miriam bundled in a shawl on the porch. Checking the property. Finding any problems? No. Everything's secure. Except you. He looked at her sharply. What's that supposed to mean? You're scared. Not of Brennan. You can handle him. You're scared of us. Of what we mean. You don't mean... Don't lie, Eli. Not now. Not after everything. She moved closer, her breath visible in the cold air. We mean something. Maybe not what we'll eventually mean, but something. And that terrifies you more than any threat Brennan could make. You're supposed to be temporary. A lot of things are supposed to be temporary. Seasons, storms, grief. She paused. But sometimes temporary is just what we tell ourselves when we're too scared to say permanent. I can't offer permanent. I told you that from the start.
You told me you couldn't offer promises. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. Promises are words.
Permanent is action. And every action you've taken, teaching Thomas, protecting Clara, preparing for winter like we'll all be here to see it through, those are permanent actions, whether you call them that or not. She was right, and he hated that she was right. Because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that he'd already failed at keeping them at arm's length, had already let them matter in ways that could destroy him if they left. Miriam? But she was already heading inside. Good night, Eli. Don't stay out too long. The house feels wrong when you're not in it. The house feels wrong when you're not in it.
Such a simple statement, but it echoed in his mind as he finished his rounds. Because she was right about that, too. The house had felt wrong for years, and he'd told himself that was just how houses felt. But now he knew better. Now he knew how a house should feel, full of voices and footsteps, purposes beyond mere shelter, life beyond mere survival. When he finally went inside, he paused at the bottom of the stairs, listening. Thomas's soft snoring from his room, Clara murmuring in her sleep. Miriam's door closing softly, the sounds of a family settling for the night. His family, some traitorous part of his mind supplied, and he didn't correct it. The next few days passed in heightened awareness. Eli found himself watching the horizon more, checking the property boundaries, teaching Thomas not just ranch work but defense, how to barricade doors, where to take cover if shooting started, how to get his mother and sister to safety.
You really think Brennan will try something? Thomas asked, practicing with the rifle Eli had given him. I think it's better to be prepared for trouble that doesn't come than unprepared for trouble that does. But trouble came from an unexpected direction. It was Miriam who spotted the smoke first, a black column rising from the direction of the eastern pasture. Fire! She shouted, ringing the bell frantically. Eli ran from the barn, saw the smoke, and felt his blood turn cold. The hay storage for winter feed was out there. If they lost that... Thomas, get the buckets and every container that holds water. Miriam, soak blankets in the water trough. Clara, stay in the house. They fought the fire for hours, bucket brigades and wet blankets against flames that seemed determined to consume everything. The smoke was thick, choking, turning the snow around them gray with ash. Thomas worked beside him, face blackened with soot, never complaining even when Eli could see his hands were blistered and bleeding. Miriam appeared and disappeared through the smoke like a ghost, bringing water, taking empty buckets. Her dress singed and her hair escaped from its pins. Even Clara, who was supposed to stay inside, appeared with a pot of water, her small face determined. I told you to stay in the house, Eli said. The house said I should help, she replied simply, and there was no time to argue. They saved most of it. Not all, probably a quarter of the hay was lost, but enough to see them through winter if they were careful. As the last flames died and they stood there exhausted, covered in soot and ash, Eli saw something that made his chest tight. They stood together, the four of them, not like employer and employees, but like a unit, as Thomas had said, like a family that had fought together and won. Was it Brennan? Thomas asked quietly. Eli studied the burn pattern, the point of origin. It could have been natural, dry hay, a spark from something, but the location, the timing, maybe. Can't prove it either way. What do? We survive. We watch. We protect what's ours. Ours, Thomas repeated, and the word hung in the air like a promise. That night, exhausted and sore, they gathered in the kitchen for a late meal. Miriam had somehow managed to prepare food despite the chaos, though she kept wincing when she moved her burned hands. Let me see, Eli said, taking her hands gently in his. The burns weren't severe, but they were painful. He got the salve he kept for such injuries, carefully applying it to the worst areas. I can do that myself, she said, but didn't pull away. I know you can. Doesn't mean you have to. Their eyes met and held, something passing between them that had nothing to do with burns or salve. Clara watched with interest while Thomas suddenly became very focused on his food. Your hands too, Thomas, Eli said, breaking the moment. Can't have you unable to work tomorrow. As he tended Thomas's blisters, Clara said, We're like a real family now. Clara, Miriam warned. We are. We fought a fire together. We protected our home. That makes us family. It makes us a good team, Eli corrected, but his heart wasn't in the deflection. Same thing, Clara said with 7-year-old certainty. Later, after the children were in bed, Eli and Miriam sat on the porch despite the cold, both too restless to sleep. If it was Brennan, she said, he'll try again. Probably. What's our plan? He noticed she said our as naturally as breathing. We be ready. We don't let him catch us off guard again. Should we go to the sheriff? Sheriff's in Brennan's pocket, has been for years. Then we handle it ourselves. We? He looked at her. This isn't your fight, Miriam. Isn't it? She turned to face him fully. My children sleep under this roof.
They call this home. That makes every threat to this place a threat to them. So yes, Eli, this is my fight. You could leave. Take the children somewhere safer. We could, she agreed. Is that what you want? The question hung between them like a challenge. A month ago, he would have said yes immediately. Even a week ago, he might have agreed it was the practical choice. But now, after fighting the fire together, after seeing Thomas work himself bloody to save the hay, after Clara's simple declaration about family, no, he said quietly. That's not what I want. Then we stay, and we fight if we have to. It could get ugly. Brennan doesn't play fair. Neither do mothers protecting their children. There was steel in her voice that reminded him she'd survived things he probably couldn't imagine. This woman had kept her children fed and safe through grief and poverty and desperation. A bully like Brennan was just another obstacle to overcome. All right, he said. We stay. We fight. She stood, pausing at the door. Eli? Earlier, when Clara said we were a family, she wasn't wrong, was she? Maybe not a traditional family, maybe not what any of us planned, but still. Miriam, I'm not asking for declarations or promises. I'm just saying that maybe we should stop pretending this is still just business. Because if we're going to fight for this place, we should at least be honest about what we're fighting for. She went inside before he could respond, leaving him alone with thoughts he'd been avoiding for weeks. Because she was right, again. This had stopped being business the moment he'd ridden for the doctor for Clara. Maybe even before that. Maybe the moment Miriam had asked him that question by the stagecoach, cutting through all his defenses with brutal honesty. The next morning brought unexpected allies. Pete Sawyer rode up with 2 other ranchers from the valley, their faces grim. Heard you had a fire, Pete said without preamble. News travels fast. Brennan was in the saloon last night, buying drinks and dropping hints about how dangerous ranching can be. Man was practically celebrating. Still can't prove anything. Don't need to, said Bill Harrison, one of the other ranchers. We all know what Brennan is. Question is, what are we going to do about it? We? You're one of us, Eli, whether you like it or not. And Brennan's been pushing all of us in different ways, but going after a man's winter feed, that crosses a line. What are you proposing? Pete grinned, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Little community organization, we take turns watching each other's property. Brennan can't burn what's being watched. And if he tries, then he learns that this valley protects its own. It was more support than Eli had expected, more than he'd thought to ask for. But then, he'd never had anything worth protecting before. Anything that made him part of the community, rather than just adjacent to it. I appreciate the offer. It's not an offer, Bill interrupted. It's what neighbors do. Besides, he glanced toward the house where Miriam was visible through the window. Man with a family can't stand watch all night and work all day. You need help, and we're providing it. A man with a family. The words should have triggered his usual denial, but they didn't, because that's what he was now, whether he'd chosen it or not. Thank you, he said simply. They worked out a schedule, each ranch providing men for night watches, a network of protection that Brennan wouldn't expect. As they were leaving, Pete pulled Eli aside. That widow and her children, they're good for you. Pete, I'm not prying, just observing. You've smiled more in the past month than in the previous 10 years. And that boy follows you around like you hung the moon. He's a good kid. He's more than that. He's looking at you like a father. You prepared for that? Was he? Eli thought about Thomas's eager questions.
his determination to learn everything, the way he'd started mimicking Eli's stance and gestures. The boy was looking for more than just instruction. He was looking for a model of how to be a man. "I'm figuring it out," Eli admitted. Pete clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. About time you stopped hiding from life." That night at dinner, Eli told them about the community watch. Thomas's face lit up. "So we're not alone? Others will help?" "Appears so." "That's wonderful," Miriam said, "to have neighbors who care. Don't get too comfortable with it. Once Brennan's dealt with, things will go back to normal." "Will they?" Claire asked innocently. "Or is this the new normal?" Once again, the child's simple question cut to the heart of things. Because this was becoming normal, the four of them at dinner, sharing the day's events, working together, protecting each other. The old normal, the isolation and silence seemed like a distant memory. "Time will tell," Eli said, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. As if to test their new arrangements, Brennan made his move 3 nights later. But instead of finding an unguarded ranch, he found Bill Harrison and his son on watch. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Brennan retreated, but not before making threats about lawyers and land rights and knowing important people in Helena. "Let him threaten," Bill told Eli the next morning. "Man's got no legal standing, and his important friends won't help him when they learn the whole valley's against him." But Eli knew Brennan wouldn't give up easily. Men like him never did. They just got sneakier, more vicious. The tension affected everyone. Thomas jumped at sudden noises. Clara stayed closer to the house. Miriam kept the rifle within easy reach, and Eli found himself constantly watching, waiting for the next attack. It came from an unexpected direction. A letter arrived, official-looking, delivered by a nervous young man from town. "What is it?" Miriam asked, seeing Eli's face as he read. "Legal notice. Brennan's challenging my water rights in court. Says there's an irregularity in the original claim." "Is there?" "No, but that won't stop him from tying it up in legal battles until I can't afford to fight anymore." "How much money are we talking about?" He noticed she said "we" again. "More than I have readily available. I'd have to sell stock, maybe even land." "Or," Miriam said quietly, "you could use this." She went to her room, returning with a small leather pouch. Inside were coins and bills, more money than he'd expected. "Where did you—" "My mother's ring. I sold it last week when we were in town. I was saving it for emergencies." She met his eyes steadily. "This qualifies." "I can't take your money." "It's not my money, it's our money, for our home, our fight." "Miriam, don't you dare get noble on me now, Eli Grant. We're in this together, or we're not in it at all. Which is it?" Eli stared at the money in Miriam's outstretched hand, understanding the weight of what she was offering. Her mother's ring had been the last thing of value she owned, the one thing she'd kept through everything, and she'd sold it without telling him, preparing for a battle that wasn't supposed to be hers. "Your mother's ring," he said roughly. "You shouldn't have. It was just metal and stone, Eli. This," she gestured to the house, the land beyond the windows, "this is real. This is home. For my children, for—" She paused, then continued more softly. "For us." Thomas appeared in the doorway, having heard the conversation. "Mama's right. We're all in this together." He pulled out a small cloth bundle from his pocket. "I've been saving too, from the work you've been paying me for." "Thomas, no!" Eli began, but Clara ran in from the other room. "I have money too." She produced a jar filled with pennies. "From helping Mrs. Morrison at the store sometimes." Looking at the three of them, offering everything they had to defend his land, Eli felt something crack inside his chest. The walls he'd built so carefully, maintained so diligently, crumbled like sand before a tide. These people, his people, were willing to sacrifice everything for a home he'd only promised them temporarily. "This isn't just about the water rights anymore, is it?" he said quietly. "No," Miriam agreed. "It never was. Brennan saw what you've been trying not to see, that this is a family worth threatening, worth using as leverage, because families have something to lose." "And something to fight for," Thomas added fiercely. Eli looked at each of them, Miriam's steady determination, Thomas's young courage, Clara's innocent trust, his family. The word no longer felt foreign or frightening, it felt right.
It felt like something worth any risk. All right, he said. We pool our resources. We fight together. But if we're doing this, we do it properly. No more pretenses about temporary arrangements or business deals. What are you saying? Miriam asked carefully. I'm saying that if we're going to fight for this ranch, it should be your ranch too, legally, properly. He took a breath, knowing he was crossing a line he'd sworn never to approach again. I'm saying we should make this official. Marriage, legal protection for you and the children, full partnership in everything. The silence that followed was complete. Even Clara seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. Miriam's face had gone pale, then flushed. Eli Grant? She said slowly. Are you proposing to me out of legal convenience? No, he said, surprising himself with his honesty. I'm proposing because somewhere between that first day and now, you and these children became essential. Because the thought of you leaving makes me feel hollow in ways I'd forgotten I could feel. Because when Clara was sick, I realized I'd ride through hell for any of you. Because this stopped being business the moment you asked me if I wanted another winter alone, and I couldn't answer. You're scared, she observed, but her voice was gentle. Terrified, he admitted, but more scared of losing you than of keeping you. That's not exactly a romantic proposal. You didn't ask for romance. You asked for honesty. I did. She moved closer, close enough that he could see the tears she was fighting. And honestly, I stopped thinking of this as temporary the night you stayed up with Clara. When you taught Thomas to shoot not just for utility, but with patience and care. When you started leaving your muddy boots next to ours by the door like they belonged together. Is that a yes? That's a, we should talk about this when we're not in crisis mode. Mama, Clara piped up, just say yes. The house wants you to. Despite everything, Eli found himself almost smiling. The house wants it? Clara nodded solemnly. It's been telling me. It says it's tired of being just a house. It wants to be a home. Clara's right, Thomas said quietly. We all know this is home now. Has been for weeks. Making it legal just makes sense. Miriam looked at her children, then at Eli. You know what you're taking on? Not just me, but them. Full responsibility, full claim on your life. I know. He met her eyes. The question is, can you take on a man who's forgotten how to be soft? Who'll probably say the wrong thing more often than right? Who's been alone so long he might not remember how to be together? I've taken on worse challenges, she said with a slight smile. At least you come with a good roof and working land. Is that a yes? That's a yes. God help us both, yes. Clara cheered and threw herself at both of them, causing an awkward three-way embrace that Thomas joined after a moment's hesitation. It wasn't romantic or graceful, but it was real, and theirs, and somehow perfect in its imperfection. We should go to town tomorrow, Eli said when they disentangled. See Judge Harper. Make it legal before Brennan can use your unmarried status against us somehow. That's very practical, Miriam said, and he couldn't tell if she was disappointed or amused. I'm a practical man. But Miriam? He waited until she looked at him. After we deal with Brennan, after the crisis passes, I want to do this right. A real wedding. Whatever you want. I don't need but you deserve. You deserve more than a rushed ceremony born of legal necessity. The children deserve to see their mother valued properly. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears again. All right. Crisis first, romance later. If you can stand the wait. Eli Grant, I've been waiting my whole life for a man who sees me as a partner rather than a possession. I can wait a little longer for the fancy parts. They spent the evening planning, not just the legal marriage, but the legal challenge, the ranch defense, the future. For the first time, Eli spread out all his papers, deeds, claims, financial records, holding nothing back. You're doing well, Miriam observed, studying the accounts. Better than well. 10 years of living like a hermit will build savings, he said dryly. Haven't had much to spend on. Until now. She looked at the children who were playing checkers by the fire. They'll need schooling, proper clothes. Clara should have music lessons if she wants them. She's got an ear for it. Whatever they need, Eli said, meaning it. They're my responsibility now. Our responsibility, she corrected. Partners, remember? The word sent a warm feeling through his chest. Partners. Not him carrying all the weight alone, but sharing it. The concept was foreign but not unwelcome. They went to town the next morning, all four of them dressed in their best clothes. The marriage was quick and legal, Judge Harper performing the ceremony with only Tom and Mrs. Morrison as witnesses. It wasn't romantic. Clara complained about the lack of flowers. But when Judge Harper pronounced them husband and wife, something settled in Eli's chest that had been restless for years. "You may kiss your bride," Judge Harper said with a knowing smile. Eli hesitated, then leaned in and kissed Miriam softly, briefly, aware of the children watching. It was their first kiss, he realized with a start. They'd agreed to marry, to partner for life, before they'd even kissed. Somehow that seemed fitting for them, everything backwards but right despite it. "Well," Tom Morrison said, pumping Eli's hand enthusiastically, "never thought I'd see the day. Eli Grant, married." "With children," Mrs. Morrison added, beaming at Thomas and Clara, "a ready-made family." The news spread through town within hours. By the time they finished getting supplies, everyone knew. The reactions ranged from pleased, Pete Sawyer bought them a drink at the saloon, though Miriam declined to enter such an establishment, to skeptical, several women who'd tried for Eli's attention themselves, to calculating Brennan's associates, already figuring how this changed the game. "Mrs. Grant," the bank clerk said when Miriam went to add her name to Eli's accounts. The title was new, strange, but she wore it with the same dignity she'd worn her patched dresses. "We should get home," Eli said as afternoon waned. "Don't want to be on the road after dark." But as they loaded the wagon, a familiar figure emerged from the saloon. Jack Brennan, slightly drunk but still dangerous, swagger in his step, and malice in his eyes. "Well, well, congratulations, Grant. Married the help, did you?" "Watch your tongue, Brennan." "Oh, protective now, are we?" How touching. Brennan's eyes traveled over Miriam insultingly. "Though I suppose a man takes what he can get. Damaged goods and another man's leavings, but beggars can't be choosers." Eli moved before thought, his fist connecting with Brennan's jaw with a satisfying crack. Brennan went down hard, blood streaming from his nose. "Eli!" Miriam grabbed his arm as Brennan's men started forward. "You'll regret that, Grant," Brennan snarled from the ground. "You and your whore and her bastards." This time it was Thomas who moved, the boy's boot connecting with Brennan's ribs. "Don't you dare talk about my mother that way." "Thomas, enough," Eli said, pulling the boy back. "He's not worth it." "This isn't over," Brennan said, struggling to his feet. "I'll ruin you, all of you." "You can try," Eli said calmly. "But you should know something, Jack. This valley protects families, and that's what we are now, family, legal and proper. You come at us, you come at all of us. Every rancher who's tired of your bullying, every townsperson you've cheated, every person you've stepped on to get ahead. We're done being afraid of you." A crowd had gathered, and Eli saw nods of agreement, heard murmurs of support. Brennan looked around, perhaps realizing for the first time that his reign of intimidation was ending. "We'll see about that," he muttered, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. The ride home was quiet at first, tension still thrumming through all of them. Then Clara, irrepressible as always, said, "Papa hit him real good." The word stopped everything. Papa. She'd said it naturally, like it had always been true. Eli's hands tightened on the reins. "Clara," Miriam said softly, "you should ask—" "It's all right," Eli interrupted, his voice rough. "She can, if she wants. It's all right." "Really?" Clara's face lit up. "I can call you Papa. If you want." "I want." She bounced in her seat. "Thomas, we have a Papa now." Thomas was more cautious, watching Eli's face. "Sir? Would it be acceptable if I also—" "Thomas," Eli said, pulling the wagon to a stop so he could look at the boy properly. "I would be honored to be your father. Maybe not the one who gave you life, but the one who'll help you grow into the man you're meant to be." Thomas's young face crumpled slightly, emotions overwhelming his attempts at maturity. "Papa," he said quietly, testing the word. "Papa." "Well," Miriam said, wiping her eyes, "this is turning into quite a day." "The best day," Clara announced. even without wedding flowers. They arrived home as the sun was setting, painting the ranch in golden light. It looked different somehow, not just a well-maintained property, but a homestead, a place where a family lived and worked and grew. "I should do evening chores," Eli said, but Miriam stopped him. "Thomas can help me tonight. We should. She blushed slightly. "It is our wedding night." The reality of that hit him suddenly. They were married, legally bound. Tonight she would share his room, his bed. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. "I don't